The chamber was supposed to be a place of order, but that day it pulsed like a battlefield. Cameras snapped in restless rhythm, pens scratched across paper, and the hum of whispers swirled in every corner. At the center of it all sat Senator Ted Cruz, leaning forward with a smirk that carried the weight of entitlement. He cut in mid-sentence, again. It was the 6th time he had sliced through Jasmine Crockett's words, his voice rising like a hammer meant to drown out not just her testimony, but her very presence. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't beg for space, didn't match his volume. Instead, she stared him down with the kind of stillness that speaks louder than any shout. The crowd noticed. A subtle shift in the air signaled that something was changing. Even those who had dismissed her as just another name on the docket could feel it now, the quiet before the storm. Cruz, of course, didn't see it. He was too busy reveling in his performance, too intoxicated by the sound of his own interruptions to notice the tide turning. His voice thundered about order, about discipline, about authority. But to the viewers watching at home and to the aides exchanging glances behind him, it wasn't discipline they saw, it was desperation masquerading as dominance. Crockett's eyes never left him. Behind them burned a patience born of harder battles, battles fought far away from the polished wood and marble of Washington. She knew what he was trying to do, wear her down, strip her dignity piece by piece. And yet, with every interruption, she grew steadier. The 6th time his words crashed over hers, the weight of the room shifted entirely. Reporters tilted forward, sensing the rhythm of a story about to write itself. Staffers leaned in, anticipation tingling through the air. There was no mistaking it now. Everyone felt the moment tightening, coiling like a spring ready to snap. And then, on his 7th interruption, the entire room went silent. It wasn't silence of courtesy. It was the silence of history holding its breath, of cameras capturing a split second where everything could change. No one expected what Crockett would say next. Been called to address policy, dense, technical matters that rarely make headlines. But the deeper truth was unavoidable. Hearings like this are where the story of America gets written. Every raised voice, every interruption, every act of silence or defiance isn't just about procedure. It's about identity. It's about whose voices get to be heard, and whose are constantly pushed aside. In that chamber, fairness itself was on trial. Not the abstract fairness of law textbooks, but the living, breathing fairness that millions of Americans crave in their everyday lives. The fairness that says every worker deserves dignity. The fairness that insists immigrants chasing a dream deserve respect, not suspicion. The fairness that refuses to let a handful of powerful men speak louder than the people they claim to represent. Ted Cruz wasn't simply debating policy, he was wielding dominance like a weapon. His interruptions weren't questions, they were declarations. Each time he cut Crockett off, he wasn't just cutting into her sentence. He was cutting into the very principle of equal voice, telling everyone watching that authority belongs to whoever can shout the loudest. For his supporters, this was theater. For millions of others, it was a reminder of every boss who never listened, every official who never cared, every powerful figure who thought respect was theirs alone to give. And that's what raised the stakes. This wasn't about one senator and one representative. This was about two Americas colliding in real time. On one side, a politics of bullying, where strength is mistaken for volume and arrogance struts as if it were leadership. On the other, a politics of dignity, where patience, persistence, and truth itself are wielded as quiet but unshakable power. Crockett represented more than her own district that day. She became a vessel for everyone who has ever been talked over, brushed aside, or treated as less than. Every immigrant who has been told to wait their turn. Every young professional whose ideas were stolen by louder colleagues. Every woman who has had to endure interruptions in boardrooms, classrooms, or even at the dinner table. In her calm resistance they saw themselves. But Cruz also represented something larger. His arrogance wasn't unique, it was emblematic. It was the swagger of entrenched power, the belief that domination is destiny, the conviction that rules are made to be bent by those who claim to uphold them. That 7th interruption didn't just hang in the air as a rude gesture. It crystallized a bigger struggle about who gets to define America's future. The hearing suddenly became more than a hearing. It became a mirror. And in that mirror, America was forced to look at itself. Would it be a nation where truth has room to breathe, or a nation where bullies write the script? Would dignity prevail, or would arrogance choke out the possibility of honest debate? But the arrogance Cruz showed here wasn't just about this one debate. It symbolized something bigger about power in America. And as Crockett prepared to respond, the weight of that symbolism pressed in from every corner of the room. Millions would soon be watching, not just to see who won an argument, but to see which version of America would speak louder in that moment. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to understand Ted Cruz. His name alone sparks sharp reactions, admiration in some circles, exasperation in many others. For over a decade, Cruz has built a reputation on sharp elbows and an even sharper tongue. He doesn't enter political arenas to listen, he enters to dominate. And in Washington, that posture has made him both impossible to ignore and impossible to fully respect. From his earliest days in the Senate, Cruz styled himself as a warrior for principle, but the principles often blurred into theater. He staged marathon speeches on the Senate floor, not to pass laws but to make headlines. He once famously read Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham during a filibuster, turning the solemn process of governance into late-night fodder. To his allies, this was evidence of tenacity. To his critics, it was arrogance parading as conviction. That tension, between how Cruz sees himself and how the world sees him, defines his career. He preaches order but thrives in chaos. He demands respect but rarely offers it. He speaks of tradition yet bends rules when it suits him. In hearing after hearing, Cruz has perfected the art of interruption, cutting off witnesses, colleagues, and even allies when they stray from his narrative. Each interjection is delivered with the practiced confidence of a man who believes volume equals authority. But arrogance has a way of leaving a trail. The viral clips tell the story. There was the heated exchange where Cruz sneered at a colleague only to be met with laughter from the gallery. There was the moment during a town hall when a constituent's calm question exposed the emptiness of his bluster. Again and again Cruz played the part of the unflinching antagonist, and yet, in the eyes of many Americans, the act rang hollow. Perhaps nothing reveals the contradictions more than his rhetoric on dignity. Cruz often wraps himself in the language of honor, chastising others for supposed breaches of decorum. Yet his own conduct paints a different picture. Interruptions, insults, smirks, time for the cameras, these are not the tools of a dignified statesman, but the habits of a showman addicted to spectacle. He demands the rules apply to others while treating them as suggestions for himself. That pattern has consequences. Even among his Republican colleagues, Cruz is known more for friction than friendship. Stories of backroom resentment swirl in Washington. Colleagues unwilling to collaborate, staffers drained by the constant battles, allies burned by his eagerness to grandstand. His rise was built on defiance, but that same defiance left him isolated. In politics, isolation breeds desperation, and desperation breeds moments like the one that unfolded in that committee room. Because to Cruz, the hearing wasn't just another hearing. It was a stage. The interruptions weren't accidents, they were choreography. Each one was designed to reaffirm dominance, to remind the cameras that he controlled the tempo. But in doing so he revealed something deeper, a fear of losing the spotlight. For someone like Cruz, attention isn't optional, it's oxygen. And without it, the image of power starts to crack. This is the arc of Cruz as the antagonist. Not the cartoonish villain twirling a mustache, but the all-too-familiar figure whose arrogance turns every debate into a battlefield. He has built a brand on belittling opponents, on interrupting their stories before they can be told. In his mind, that strategy has worked. But history is filled with moments when arrogance overplayed its hand, when domination stumbled into downfall. And this, precisely, is what made his clash with Jasmine Crockett so electric. He had faced many opponents before, professors, senators, witnesses, journalists, and he had sharpened his tactics against them all. But Crockett was different. She was calm where he expected fluster. She was patient where he demanded chaos. She didn't just refuse to yield the floor, she refused to yield her dignity. For Cruz, that was an unfamiliar battlefield. He had prepared to overwhelm, not to be disarmed. He had prepared to win by volume, not to lose to silence. And so, while he leaned forward in that chair, smirk curling, convinced that the seventh interruption would seal his dominance, he didn't realize what everyone else was beginning to sense. But in Crockett, he would face a kind of resistance he hadn't anticipated. To understand why Jasmine Crockett sat so still, so calm while Ted Cruz thundered over her, you have to know the road that carried her to that chair. Hers is not the story of someone who inherited power. It is the story of someone who wrestled with life, who bore the weight of struggle and transformed it into resilience. Crockett didn't rise because doors were opened for her. She rose because she refused to let them stay closed. Long before Washington, she learned the power of voice in places where voices were often ignored. Growing up, she knew what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed, and pushed aside. The lessons didn't come in textbooks. They came in real time, in classrooms where teachers doubted her potential, in workplaces where respect wasn't given freely, and in communities where resources were scarce. For Crockett, silence wasn't a choice, it was an imposition. And that's precisely why she vowed never to accept it again. Her early career in public service didn't sparkle with glamour. It was built case by case, often in courtrooms where she represented those who had no one else willing to fight for them. Families struggling to pay rent, workers cheated by employers, neighbors trapped in cycles of neglect. Crockett stood with them when standing meant late nights, low pay, and little recognition. But those battles carved something in her spirit. They taught her that dignity is not a gift from the powerful, it is a birthright that must be defended. She knew what it meant to lose and to get back up. She knew the sting of being told, "Wait your turn," the exhaustion of being spoken over, the frustration of watching arrogance fill spaces where humility should have reigned. Every trial she endured etched another layer of patience, another spark of fire. And though her opponents often towered with titles, she carried something they lacked: authenticity. When Crockett stepped into politics, she did not come with a golden name or inherited networks. She came with grit. She came with the credibility of someone who had walked the same streets, struggled with the same bills, and carried the same anxieties as the people she sought to represent. She was not the polished insider groomed for the cameras. She was the underdog who knew what it meant to be on the margins. That authenticity resonated. It made her not just a politician, but a mirror for ordinary Americans who were tired of watching bullies in power treat leadership like a stage for their own egos. Every campaign stop, every speech, every rally was laced with that core truth. She didn't rise to speak for herself, she rose to speak for those who had been interrupted for far too long. And that's what made her presence in the chamber so electrifying. When Cruz tried to cut her off, he wasn't just silencing Crockett. He was attempting, symbolically, to silence all of those voices she carried with her. The immigrant mother working double shifts. The young student told their dreams were unrealistic. The voter who felt invisible in a system tilted against them. Crockett was their echo, their amplifier, their living proof that dignity could step into the room and hold its ground. Her patience was not weakness. It was strategy forged in fire. She had endured louder voices before. Judges who sneered, opponents who condescended, critics who dismissed her as unworthy. And every time she learned the value of composure. To stay steady when others raged was not to concede defeat. It was to wield a different kind of strength. The strength that outlasts the noise, the strength that forces bullies to stumble over their own arrogance. Her fire, too, was never reckless. It was the fire of someone who had watched injustice firsthand, someone who had felt the system grind against the people it was supposed to protect. That fire kept her relentless when resources were scarce, when doors were closed, when cynics told her the climb was impossible. It burned not for herself, but for those who had entrusted her with their hopes. And her dignity, perhaps her greatest weapon, wasn't polished in elite institutions or groomed in marble halls. It was earned. Earned by treating people with respect when she had none left to give. Earned by holding her ground when power tried to shove her aside. Earned by refusing to let interruptions define her voice. So when Cruz's interruptions thundered through the chamber, Crockett's calm wasn't passivity. It was the composure of someone who had been tested before and had always come back stronger. Her stillness was the sharpened edge of experience, a patience ready to turn into power at exactly the right moment. The reporters in the room didn't know her full story. The viewers at home might not have known the details of her journey. But they felt it. They sensed it in her gaze, in the way she refused to break, in the silence she held like a shield. Crockett was not there as one woman battling one senator. She was there as the embodiment of something larger, ordinary Americans who wanted dignity restored, truth defended, and arrogance exposed. And those life lessons prepared her perfectly for this one explosive moment. The confrontation did not erupt all at once. It built like a storm, each interruption another crack of thunder rolling through the chamber. From the very first exchange, Cruz made it clear he had no intention of letting Jasmine Crockett's words breathe. The first interruption was swift, almost casual, like a test jab. Crockett began outlining her point when Cruz leaned forward, voice slicing across hers. He framed it as a clarification, but the effect was unmistakable, a man asserting control. Crockett paused, let the air settle, then continued without raising her volume. That small refusal to flinch was the first signal. The second interruption came sharper. Cruz leaned back in his chair, then surged forward mid-sentence as if his authority were being challenged simply by her persistence. He spoke with the self-certainty of someone used to cutting others off without consequence. Crockett's response was to hold her composure, her tone measured, her eyes unshaken. If anything, his rising volume only made her stillness more visible. By the third interruption, the rhythm of the hearing had shifted. Cruz's voice rang louder, carrying a touch of impatience, a touch of theater for the cameras. But Crockett didn't match him. Instead, she began to embody a different kind of defiance, deliberate calm. Staffers in the background exchanged glances. They had seen this performance before, but something about Crockett's refusal to rise to the bait unsettled the script. The fourth interruption grew heavier, more desperate. Cruz no longer cloaked his tone in the pretense of clarification. He was openly talking over her. Crockett adjusted her posture, leaning forward slightly, letting her silence frame his outburst. The effect was uncanny. He seemed louder, she seemed stronger. A murmur rippled through the gallery. By the fifth time the whispers grew. Colleagues shifted in their seats. The repetition was becoming undeniable. Cruz wasn't just debating. He was attempting to erase her from the record. Yet Crockett's restraint amplified the imbalance. Her refusal to crack transformed each interruption into evidence, not of her weakness but of his insecurity. The sixth interruption pushed the tension to a breaking point. Cruz's tone grew sharp, impatient, almost shouting now. He gestured with his hands, eyes narrowed, convinced that force of voice equaled force of argument. Cameras caught the moment, Crockett staring straight ahead, refusing to surrender even an inch. She let him burn through his performance, and in that stillness she became the eye of the storm. The chamber vibrated with unease. The clicking of camera shutters quickened. Aides leaned in to whisper to their bosses. Reporters scribbled notes, sensing the arc of something viral. Everyone could feel the pattern reaching its limit. 6 times he had cut her off, 6 times she had absorbed the blow without bending. It was no longer a clash of policy points, it was a duel of wills. Cruz leaned back, lips curling into a smirk, readying himself for yet another interruption. He was certain that on the 7th strike, the performance would land as dominance, that Crockett's patience would finally splinter. But he misread her completely. Because while Cruz had grown louder with each interruption, Crockett had only grown steadier. While he had fed the camera's noise, she had cultivated silence as her shield. The room, tense and coiled, was waiting not for his words but for hers. And so, as his 7th interruption cut the air like a blade, everything shifted. The noise drained out, leaving behind a silence that pressed against the walls like history itself leaning closer. But on the 7th time, Crockett didn't just answer, she changed the entire game. The 7th interruption cracked across the chamber like the snap of a whip. Cruz's voice, louder now than at any point before, cut into Crockett's words with the arrogance of a man convinced his dominance was permanent. He leaned forward in his chair, fingers stabbing the air, his words tumbling over themselves as though speed and force could erase everything she had been building. It was his performance distilled, arrogance dressed up as certainty. And then, silence. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was heavier than that, a silence that pressed on the room like a weight, thick with anticipation. Cruz's voice trailed into the void he hadn't expected, the chamber no longer echoing with his interruptions but holding its breath for the woman he thought he had silenced. Jasmine Crockett lifted her gaze and locked eyes with him. Calm. Steady. Her face carried no sign of anger, no crack of impatience. Instead, there was something sharper. Composure honed into precision, the kind of composure born from knowing exactly when to strike. She waited a beat, 1 second, 2, 3, long enough for the cameras to catch the stillness, long enough for everyone in that room to realize she was about to deliver something worth remembering. Cruz shifted in his chair, the faintest trace of unease flashing across his face. And then Crockett began. Her voice didn't rise to match his. It stayed level, calm, resonant. Senator Cruz, she said, her tone carrying a weight that pierced through the air, this isn't about how many times you interrupt me. This is about why you're interrupting at all. A murmur rolled through the gallery. Cruz's smirk faltered just slightly. You've spoken about respect, about order, she continued, never breaking her gaze. But let's be clear, respect isn't shown by talking over someone 6 times in a row. Respect is earned by listening, by allowing truth to stand on its own, not by drowning it out. Gasps and whispers rose around the chamber. Phones tilted upward as staffers realized this was the moment, the clip that would leave the room and explode into the wider world. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice softening, forcing the room to lean in. You interrupt because you're afraid of what I have to say. You interrupt because you can't allow people to hear the truth without your filter plastered over it. But I didn't come here to play your game. I came here to speak for the people who are tired of games altogether. Her words landed with the rhythm of a gavel. Each phrase sharp, deliberate, impossible to dismiss. Cruz's eyes darted briefly, scanning the room, as if looking for reinforcement that wasn't there. She paused again, letting the silence hang, daring him to fill it. "You didn't?" "You see, Senator," she said, her tone now carrying the cadence of lived experience, "I know what it feels like to be interrupted. I know what it's like to be told to wait my turn, to watch arrogance masquerade as authority. Millions of Americans know that feeling, too. And every time you cut me off, you weren't just cutting me off, you were cutting them off." The words hit with seismic force. Reporters scribbled furiously. A few heads in the gallery nodded, whispers swelling into a current of agreement. Crockett did not stop there. She reached into the arsenal Cruz hadn't expected: facts. "Let's talk about the issue at hand," she said, pivoting seamlessly. "The people want solutions, not spectacle. They want leaders who are serious about justice, about equity, about building a country where voices are heard instead of trampled. That's what this hearing was supposed to be about. That's what you keep running from." It was a takedown, both moral and practical. She had framed his interruptions not as strength but as weakness. Not as dominance but as fear. And in doing so, she stripped his performance of its power. Cruz shifted again, shoulders tightening. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. The cameras caught it. The hesitation, the rare moment when his rehearsed rhythm broke. Crockett pressed on, her voice now carrying the resonance of history. "You call it order when you silence people like me. But history will remember it differently. History will remember who shouted and who stood tall. History will remember who interrupted, and who refused to be erased." The room erupted, not in applause but in energy, in gasps, in the unmistakable hum of recognition. It was the sound of people realizing they were witnessing something viral before their eyes. For the first time in the hearing, Cruz sat back, rattled. The smirk had vanished. His face tightened, his eyes flickered, the armor of arrogance cracking under the weight of composure. He had played his hand, the same hand he'd played countless times before, but Crockett had called it, dismantled it, and turned it into proof of her strength. And she wasn't done. "Senator Cruz," she concluded, her tone quiet but firm, "you don't have to listen to me. You don't even have to respect me. But you cannot stop me. Because I don't speak just for myself. I speak for millions who are tired of arrogance drowning out dignity, who are tired of noise pretending to be truth. And no matter how many times you interrupt, that truth will stand." The chamber buzzed with electricity. Phones were held high now, recording every second. Social media timelines were already filling with the footage, hashtags forming in real time. The power in the room had shifted entirely, away from Cruz's volume and into Crockett's calm. In that moment, Crockett wasn't just answering Cruz, she was speaking for millions. Section 7. The Aftermath Shockwaves, 800 words. The clip didn't just stay in the hearing room. Within minutes, it spilled across screens everywhere, racing from one phone to the next like a spark catching dry grass. On Twitter, hashtags erupted almost instantly: hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag Cruz shutdown, hashtag truth over noise. By the end of the day, they weren't just hashtags, they were rallying cries. Millions replayed the moment when Cruz's seventh interruption was flipped on its head. Some clipped it down to the piercing line about respect. Others highlighted the silence before Crockett began speaking. The pauses, the stillness, the calm power, it was cinematic in a way that politics rarely delivers. Memes flooded the internet. One showed Cruz mid-interruption with the caption, "Volume is not equal to victory." Another froze Crockett's steady gaze, overlaying it with the words, "Respect is earned by listening." TikTok stitched the exchange into dramatic edits, set against pulsing music and captions that framed Crockett as a modern-day heroine. Late-night comedians latched on immediately, replaying the clip with exaggerated imitations of Cruz's constant interruptions before cutting back to Crockett's devastating calm. Audiences roared, not just with laughter but with the thrill of recognition. Commentators across the spectrum weighed in. Progressive hosts hailed the exchange as a masterclass in dignity under fire. Even some centrists admitted that, regardless of politics, the optics were undeniable. Cruz looked rattled while Crockett looked composed. Conservative voices tried to spin it differently, but even in their critiques, they couldn't escape the virality of the moment. The footage had spoken louder than any spin could. But it wasn't just pundits and comedians. Ordinary Americans took ownership of the clip. Teachers shared it with the caption, "This is how you handle a bully in the classroom." Parents posted it alongside stories of telling their kids to stand tall when others try to shout them down. Workers in offices and factories reposted it, comparing it to their own experiences of being ignored in meetings, interrupted by bosses, or dismissed in daily life. Crockett's clapback wasn't just politics, it was relatable. It was personal. In immigrant households, the clip held another layer of resonance. Many saw in Crockett the embodiment of what it means to hold dignity against arrogance. They replayed her words not only for the satisfaction of watching Cruz silenced, but for the affirmation that patience, resilience, and truth could triumph in a system stacked against them. For families who had known what it meant to be spoken over, the clip became proof that one voice, steady and unyielding, could pierce through the noise. The ripple effect grew larger by the hour. Articles framed Crockett as a rising force, her moment with Cruz described as the exchange heard around America. Editorials noted how rare it was for such an interaction to break through the constant churn of political drama, and how telling it was that people were hungry for it. She wasn't celebrated for being loud, but for being firm. She wasn't trending because she shouted, but because she didn't need to. And while Cruz had aimed to dominate the spotlight, he found himself at the center of memes mocking his interruptions, his smirk, his visible stumble. The performance he thought would display strength instead highlighted fragility. The man who prided himself on control suddenly looked like the one who had lost it. The cultural moment was undeniable. Crockett had become more than a congresswoman defending her time in a hearing, she became a symbol. A symbol of standing tall against arrogance. A symbol of how patience can be power, how silence can disarm noise, how dignity can dismantle spectacle. In barbershops, in churches and coffee shops the clip was replayed. People leaned across counters and said, "Did you see what she did to Cruz?" Others nodded, smiling, proud that for once arrogance had been checked in real time. For many it wasn't just a political highlight, it was validation. It told them that the experiences they carried, of being interrupted or dismissed, were not theirs alone. By the week's end, Crockett was invited onto major shows. She was asked how she kept her composure, what was running through her mind, how she found the words. She answered with the same calm she had shown in the chamber, that it wasn't about her, but about truth, and about representing those who were tired of arrogance pretending to be authority. The moment was already cemented. A clash that began as just another chaotic hearing had transformed into something larger. Crockett's calm dismantling of Cruz would be studied, replayed, and remembered. Not simply as a takedown but as a shift in the conversation about what real strength looks like. But the true power of her response wasn't just in the takedown, it was in the lesson it left behind. When the storm of interruptions and rebuttals faded, something deeper lingered. Crockett understood it wasn't about trading insults or racking up viral moments. The real story wasn't her against Ted Cruz, it was truth against noise, dignity against arrogance. And as she leaned into her final words, she framed the clash in a way that lifted it beyond the spectacle of one committee room. "This isn't about me versus him," she said, her voice even unshaken. "This is about whether truth still matters more than who can shout the loudest." Those words cut through the tension with a clarity that echoed beyond the walls. They weren't just directed at Cruz or at the senators gathered, or even at the journalists typing furiously in the back. They were for everyone watching across the country who had felt drowned out by arrogance in their own lives, whether in classrooms, workplaces, or around kitchen tables. She transformed a political scuffle into a mirror for the nation. And in that mirror, America saw itself. On one side, the temptation to dominate through noise, through interruption, through raw displays of power. On the other side, the resilience of dignity, quiet, patient, unyielding. Crockett reminded everyone that strength isn't measured in decibels but in steadiness. That real authority doesn't come from silencing others, but from refusing to be silenced. She spoke of fairness, of the idea that every voice, whether immigrant or native-born, wealthy or working class, deserves space to be heard. She reminded the chamber that the American promise has always been about more than power plays. It has been about the conviction that truth, however fragile it may seem in the moment, always outlasts the noise designed to bury it. The lesson hit home because it wasn't abstract. It was lived. Everyone had seen Cruz try to bulldoze his way through the exchange. Everyone had seen Crockett's calm dismantle it. The contrast was undeniable, and in that contrast lay the moral. Arrogance burns hot but burns out quickly. Dignity may appear quiet but it endures. Her closing reflection carried the tone of both challenge and invitation. She didn't demand agreement, she called for respect. She didn't stoke division, she invited unity through integrity. And in doing so, she pulled the audience into something larger than partisanship. She reminded them that the true American tradition isn't in shouting down our neighbors but in rising up together with honesty, courage, and respect. Crockett's words soared because they tapped into a hunger the country rarely admits. A hunger for discourse that uplifts rather than degrades, for leaders who speak to the best of us instead of pandering to the worst. In a moment where noise seemed to dominate the national stage, she dared to insist that the still, steady truth was stronger. And as the cameras captured her final line, it crystallized the moral in a way no headline could dilute. Because when arrogance interrupts dignity, history always remembers who stood tall. The room fell into the kind of silence that doesn't ask for rebuttal. It wasn't the silence of intimidation, but the silence of recognition. Even her opponents couldn't deny it. Something timeless had just been spoken. For those watching, the moral lingered long after the clip ended. It became more than a memory of Cruz being rattled. It became a reminder that truth, when spoken with composure, can pierce through the loudest chaos. It reassured ordinary Americans that they didn't need to match arrogance with arrogance. They needed only to hold fast to dignity. And so, from the swirl of interruptions and grandstanding, Crockett had carved out something lasting. A moral compass moment, one that told a weary audience the American spirit was not lost. It was still here, alive in the steady voices that refused to bow to noise. History, after all, doesn't celebrate those who shouted the loudest. It remembers those who stood the tallest. It all came down to that seventh interruption. Cruz thought he was tightening his grip on the moment, but in reality he was unraveling it. What began as his attempt to dominate ended as his own undoing. That single exchange revealed the truth of the entire hearing. Arrogance may thunder for a while, but it can't withstand the calm weight of dignity. The cameras didn't remember the noise. They remembered the silence, the pause before Crockett's words, the composure in her delivery, the clarity in her truth. That was the moment people replayed, the moment that spread across millions of screens, the moment that made America lean in and listen. Because this story isn't just about a senator and a congresswoman. It's about something much bigger. It's about whether we let chaos define us, or whether we choose truth. It's about whether bullies get to write the narrative, or whether dignity finally takes its rightful place at the center of American discourse. Crockett showed that you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to match arrogance with arrogance. All you need is the courage to stand tall, even when the noise feels overwhelming. And that is why her response wasn't just a clapback. It was a reminder of who we are, and who we still can be. If you believe dignity matters more than arrogance, share this story. Let it ripple beyond this video, into every space where noise tries to drown out truth. And if you're ready to be part of a movement that exposes lies and uplifts honesty, subscribe now. Because this is just the beginning, and together we can ensure the truth always speaks louder than chaos.